The wind came off the mountain like a knife, thin and merciless, razoring through coats and talk alike. Snow hissed across Main Street, needling faces red as the townsfolk pressed in, shoulder to shoulder around the courthouse steps. Boots thudded, the wooden stoop, chains clinked against the railing. Smoke from the smithy drifted low, stale with coal and wet leather. Above it all, a bell tolled once flat and cold as a shovel striking frozen earth. "Bring him forward," barked Magistrate Hole Crowder, his voice cutting through the murmur. He wore a black oilskin slick with sleet, collar fur-lined eyes, flat as river stones. Beside him, his clerk unrolled a paper with blue-blooded importance and cleared his throat as though he were about to auction off the sky. Two girls stood shivering at the bottom step. One clutched a rag doll whose button I winked whenever the wind twitched it. The other stared at her bare knees, blotched and raw above borrowed boots 2 sizes too big. Between them, their mother Eliza Harrow held fast, one arm around each child, fingers whitened at the knuckles. Her hair, once surely neat, was knotted and plastered with wet flakes. She was the only thing that didn't rattle. "This proceeding," droned the clerk, "concerns the matter of unpaid levies and moral fitness." Moral fitness. A man snorted from the crowd. Someone hushed him. Someone else coughed into a mitten. Leather creaked. Breath smoked. The crowd tilted forward another inch, as if the storm itself had leaned in to listen. Crowder lifted one hand, and the clerk fell. "Silent woman," he said, "you've had grace enough. The house now belongs to the county. Your debts to mercantile and mill are noted. By statute, without a proper guardian of means," his mouth made that word taste fine, "your young are to be placed." Eliza's jaw tightened. She looked past the magistrate to the squitiongre, bruised at the edges and, then out over the faces. Neighbors who'd shared sugar and gossip. Men from the livery with damp scarves. The pastor with snow gathering in his whiskers. Girls from the laundry twisting fingers in aprons. The world had come to see whether mercy was cheaper than wood. "Please," Eliza said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it traveled as if it had weight. "Please, take my daughters." The words hit the steps and went still. "But take them. Together," she swallowed. "Don't split them. Don't sell them separate." The littler girl pressed into her side, and the doll's button winked as if in prayer. A ripple went through the crowd like wind through wheat. Some looked away, ashamed of what they'd come to witness. Others leaned harder, warmed by the closeness of cruelty they didn't have to own. The magistrate's lips twitched. "No one is selling anyone," he said, savoring the lie by dressing it in law. "We are placing them where they can be a benefit. A boy earns his keep. A girl can mind a stove. 2 together," he wagged the paper. 2 together is a charity this county does not fund. Chains ticked against the rail when a deputy shifted. The sound made the girls flinch, a quick, bird-like tremor that drew a soft gasp from somewhere in the line of women. The storm pressed against hats and hymns, snow pebbles clacking on the courthouse eaves. From the back of the crowd, a figure did not lean. He stood as if rooted to something older than town and law, tall under a rough wool coat that carried the ghost of pine smoke. The brim of his hat wore a pale frosted edge. His beard was winter thick, not trimmed for anyone's comfort. He had a scar just visible when the wind lifted the brim white and crooked, like a lightning fork that had changed its mind and settled into skin. He said nothing. He did nothing. He watched. People near him gave him space the way you give a black bear the path at once. "That's him," someone whispered. "The one they say winters alone above Kingfisher Pass." Another voice, "A trapper, or a hunter. Or worse." Then, softer, "Thomas Vale, they call him. Mountain man." The clerk resumed. "Bids pardon petitions will be heard for the placement of the miners. Suitable households only." He coughed into a fist and looked toward the general store owner, who had already stepped a forward half-step, eyes calculating. Behind him, the mill foreman tugged his gloves, thinking in sacks of flour and small hands that could sort shuttles. Eliza straightened. No taller than she had been a moment before, yet somehow higher. "You will not split them," she said again, quieter this time. Voice pitched to reach only the men who wished it hadn't. "If you have to take them, then take me with. Or take none." Crowder smiled with the patience of a man who likes his own rules. "You do not set terms. The county does." He nodded at the deputy. The deputy set his boot on the first step. The chains brushed the oak, a faint tinsel sound that might have been festive if it hadn't been winter and ruin. "Please," Eliza said, and the word ran on fresh legs now, failing to hide, breaking from one person to the next until even those who'd come for spectacle felt the tug of it. "Please, take my daughters together." A woman in the back pressed a mitten to her mouth. The pastor's brow folded into something like a question aimed at God. The store owner cleared his throat, readying his numbers. The wind shifted. Snow lifted off the roofs and whirled down into the hollow made by the crowd. A grey-white snake, it hissed and made the lanterns flutter. Smoke from the smithy thickened and the smell of scorched iron and wet wool hung low enough to taste. The mountain man did not blink. He watched the way a hawk watches a field, not with sympathy, with certainty. Proceed, proceed, Crowder said. The first petition came from the general store, dry goods and dry eyes. We can take the older girl, he said. Stove and counter. Lodging provided. The little one is too small to be of much use, said the mill foreman, efficient as a ledger. But the older might learn the spindles quick. The word older moved like a knife between the sisters. The older girl, 16, grabbed her mother's skirt. The younger pressed the doll until its seam popped a little, showing stuffing like a wound. Together, Eliza said, breath turning to steam. Together or not at all. Crowder's smile turned formal. It will be as the county sees fit. He raised his hand again, as if he could raise the storm with it. Boothiel's drum stroked the steps behind the storekeeper, another man eager to show his virtue and enlarge his household at once. Crowder's deputy reached gentle practiced award. The older girl's arm, the mountain man took one step forward. No, one saw him make the decision. It arrived on the wood like another gust, quiet and implacable. The crowd parted, not with courtesy but with relief like water finding a channel it had hoped was there. He moved without hurry, big and deliberate, coat shedding a ghost of snow. When he reached the bottom step, he didn't look at Eliza first, or at the girls. He looked at Crowder. The magistrate's eyes narrowed. This is an officer proceeding. Sir, you are welcome to apply for. The mountain man said nothing. He reached into his coat, slow as weather, and took out a leather pouch that thunked when it hit the rail. The sound was small and enormous, at once metal on wood, promise on law. Coins. Not just coins. Something heavier in there. A ring, a bullet, a nail bent and straightened again. A life's pocket. His voice, when he finally spoke, surprised the air by being gentle. I heard a mother ask a simple mercy, he said. Seems to me a decent town can answer it. No one moved. Even the wind listened. Crowder smiled again. A thin cutting thing. Decency, he said, is best managed by statute. The mountain man's eye-stone blew under the brim, flicked past the magistrate to Elisa. He didn't nod, he didn't soften, he only looked. And in the look there was the strangest promise. Not rescue, not yet, but witness. He turned his palm and the pouch's mouth fell open, showing worn silver, a brass token. A wolf's tooth threaded on rawhide. Behind him, someone whispered, Thomas Vale. Another, he ain't from here. A third, maybe that's the point. The deputy's hand hovered, indecisive now. The chain at the rail tapped, tapped. The bell didn't ring again. The storm breathed in and held. Proceed, Crowder repeated, sharper this time. His word tried to force the world forward. It would, but not the way he expected. The winter that pressed its thumb on Eliza Harrow did not begin with snow. It began with sweetness. Late summer had stamped gold into the hills, and the river lazed in long green curves where the girls splashed and shrieked, hair stuck to their temples. Eliza stood at the kitchen table with a wooden spoon and a pot the color of a bruise, coaxing blackberries into jam. The small house smelled like warm sugar and wildness. Sun pooled on the floorboards and climbed the checked curtains. Out on the porch, Matthew Harrow tuned a fiddle with the patience of a clockmaker, testing a string, smiling at some private nothing that only content men know. Careful, Lily, Eliza called without turning as the littler girl dragged a stool, intent on seeing, you'll topple and land in my pot, and then what would I spread on toast? A very sticky child. Lily considered this gravely. Add butter, she said. The older girl, Mara, laughed lighter, freer, that shivery laugh of a girl who hasn't yet learned how a laugh can catch in the throat and turn to a cough of grief. Eliza slid the pot off the flame. Fetch the jars, she told Mara, the ones we boiled, and if you see your father, tell him to play turkey in the straw slow enough for my feet. Matthew called from the porch, having heard, through the open door, because a good house leaks sound the same way it leaks light. He was a handsome man in the ordinary way, strong shoulders, work-red hands, a mouth that softened like sun at the edges whenever his girl spoke. That ordinary handsomeness felt like a blessing precisely because it had been worn to fit her. He came in to steal a kiss and got a wooden spoon on the wrist instead. Mox called it away. The girls clapped at the pantomime, a family's favorite play, performed without a script and better every time. They ate toast that evening on the porch steps. The first jar sealed with a gentle pop, a small confidence in the future. Bees thickened, and then thinned as the day kneaded itself toward night. Somewhere far off, a hawk wrote its name on the sky and erased it. Matthew played a tune so simple, it was almost the sound of walking home in the dark. Remember this, Elisa told herself in no particular words. Not because she feared it leaving, because she wanted to be greedy with it. Because joy felt like a fruit she could bottle and put on a shelf against February. The girls fell asleep with purple stains on their lips. The first sign that sweetness curdles came on a weekday in a neat envelope stamped with the mill's seal. Mara brought it from the lane, pinched between forefinger and thumb as if it could sting. Eliza wiped her hands on her apron, looked at the seal, and felt nothing in particular. Official paper had never held any power in a house that ran on bread and sweat and music. She broke the red circle with a thumbnail, thinking about whether there was enough lard for pie, by order of the surveyor's office. She read. The words took shape in her mouth like pebbles. New taxation schedule, improvement levy, arrears computed from a date no one had said aloud, a signature she didn't recognize under a stamp she did not respect. When Matthew came in, cheeks blown red from the plainer hair, Sawdust Astucci handed him the letter. He did not sit, he bent and read where he stood, and the way his shoulders squared told her something very small had shifted under the house. The way ice under a river can crack without moving water, they'll fix it, Mara said, quick with the child's belief that grown men bend to fairness because they say they do, won't they? Matthew folded the letter once and set it on the mantel, a red seal on a wooden heart. They'll try, Bug, he said, and we'll do what we always do, make our own luck. He kissed Eliza on the temple as if to anchor the words, then went back out to the day. Luck is a mule with its own opinions. That autumn the mill added a second shift and a new belt that ran mean, hungry for fabric and fingers. Matthew took on overtime because money is the only voice that answers other money. In the house, Eliza knitted hats for the surveyors because a woman can't spit in a man's soup if she wants him to drink it and change his mind. She brought a jar of blackberry jam summer-glassed and sealed to the office with the ledger, and watched a clerk blink at it like it was foreign currency. Or take payment at the desk window, he said, looking over her head for a taller problem. Then came the day the new belt jumped. It jumped because machines in a hurry forget they serve a human pulse. Matthew's hand was near. The doctor said words like crush and splint, and maybe, if the swelling goes down, the splint turned to a stiff glove of healing, and the glove turned to a hand that could hold a cup but not a plane, a fiddle bow but not a paycheck. The surveyors came again. They measured with a chain and a little brass wheel, neat and exact across a field where Lily had left her dollies. T-set, a man with a mustache like a broom, leaned on the fence. You'll be compensated, he said, which is what men say when they aren't. Snow threatened in a sky still pretending to be fall. Eliza pulled out the heavy quilts. She fed the stove with wood. Matthew refused to ask for help cutting. The girls learned not to flinch when he swore under his breath at a cup that rolled out of his fingers. He didn't like being witnessed in his small defeats. She learned to make those defeats private, distracting the girls with stories, with tasks, with jam on cold biscuits, with a laugh that she sometimes had to build like a barn from lumber that creaked sometimes. If a day had been cruel, Matthew would go out to the porch and play. Music is a rope you can throw across a chasm when words won't reach. He played that rope in the cold. His breath rose like another instrument. He stopped when his fingers forgot an old tune. He stared at the bow as if it had betrayed him, and then set it down like a prayer set down unfinished. The fever came like a thief that knows the house. Lily caught it first, cheeks flushed in a way that fooled a stranger into calling it pretty. Eliza laid cool cloths and hummed every lullaby she had. Matthew leaned his head against the door jamb when he thought no one watched. Mara suddenly, a lieutenant, boiled water and did not cry where her sister could see. The fever left Lily exhausted but laughing, like a drunk girl waking in a church. It did not leave Matthew. It found him and stayed, laying a red banner on his face that meant his body was burning its furniture to stay warm. The doctor came twice. The second time, he set his bag down slower. He asked to speak to Eliza by the stove while steam from the kettle opaqued the window and made the world small. He spoke in the tone men use when they don't want to say the thing but know they are paid to. The words didn't matter, the tone did. Eliza heard the tone and understood everything. She kept her hands on the kettle so they would not float up and become useless birds. When he left, she leaned her forehead on the cool of the door and didn't weep. She couldn't. Crying would have been debt she could not pay. On the last night, Matthew asked for the fiddle. His voice wandered like a man looking for a hat in the dark. A tune, he said, and then smiled the old smile. so sweet and sheepish it cut worse than any saw. Just to remember the shape of it, Elisa set it in his hands. He held bow to strings and made a sound that was not music and was exactly grief, cat scratch and river ice, a sound that said, I was here. Mara climbed onto the bed and tucked herself in the crook of his good arm. Lily fell asleep with her cheek on the quilt where his hip rose. Eliza stood beside the bed like a tree that had decided somehow to grow inside a house. Promise me, he said into a shallow dawn. Men ask for promises when they want to be sure they will not be forgotten. Keep them together. I will. She said it without embroidery, because vows are stronger when you don't dress them up. I will. By noon, the house had one fewer breath in it. The town came with pies and advice. Advice is a pie that looks good until you cut it and find its wind. Pastor Clegg read a verse that sounded like it had been written for someone else but was offered with love, and Eliza didn't insult the love by refusing the verse. The mill sent word, a small something from the benevolent fund, a larger something from the man who'd made the belt decision, Hale Crowder's brother who bore a face like a slate. He did not meet Eliza's eyes when he set the coins on the table. Obliged to your husband for that day, he said, and then shrugged, because gratitude embarrassed him. He left the coins. They were heavy, and then they were gone. Winter came legitimate then, no longer bluffing. The roof learned a new vocabulary of cold. Eliza learned to make soup from almost and bread from if she traded the wedding band, the thin gold circle that had warmed under dishwater and bound her finger so long she had a pale mark like a ghost ring for medicine and flour. The pawnbroker took it with professional pity. She wrapped her finger with a strip of rag because emptiness sometimes hurts more than tightness. Crowder stepped into her life like a man stepping onto a porch he had built. He wore law like a coat and precision like a knife. By statute, he said, the way men say the name of a horse they rode to victory, She stood without sitting. A woman in grief spends days horizontal. Standing becomes a statement. I will pay, she said. We will manage. My girl Mara can take mending. Lily is quick at numbers. You will not, he said, with the smile he saved for people he liked least. You will fail, and then the county will do what it is designed to. This is not a cruelty, it is a system. Systems are made by people, Eliza said. People can choose, he shrugged. I did. The last warmth of autumn died in that shrug. She worked. She took in washing until her knuckles chapped like apples left too long on their tree. She mended until her eyes burned and the needle hummed like a mosquito and she swatted at it only in her dreams. She scrubbed floors on knees that had known better prayers. When the girls slept, she sat in the lamplight and counted coins that did not add up to rescue. Sometimes in the dark slice of hours when a house makes settling noises and a woman remembers every voice that has gone quiet, she stood at the window and looked at the small square of sky and found Orion. Well, she would say to the hunter as if he could shoot a law out of the air, you're a man with a belt. Do something. The sky kept its own counsel. Once, not long before the courthouse steps, she went to the river alone. She took the empty jam jar that had been the first to seal and the last to be opened. The glass, when clean, was so clear it didn't seem like anything at all, a trick like hope. She knelt in the snow and dipped it into the water, filled it to the lip, and screwed the lid tight. She set it on the bank where the sun thin that day found it, and watched light break in the water. There, she said softly. Summer. If anyone asks, he told the girls they were going to town to talk to a man with a stamp. She braided their hair the same way she had on the summer porch, but the braids did not hang the same. They felt like rope. Mara set her jaw like her father and said nothing. Lily tried not to shiver and failed. Eliza put her own fear where children cannot reach it, in the place behind the ribs where mothers keep the things they never say. On the courthouse steps, no needling chains ticking, she discovered the last thing. Humiliation has a taste. It tastes like iron and the acid of an empty stomach. It tastes like the word please when you know the men who hear it have never had to use it for anything except to be polite at tables already set for them. She said it anyway. Said it the way you say a prayer you aren't sure will work, because you have nothing else. Please, she said. Please, take my daughters, but keep them together. The crowd murmured the way crowds do when they are both jury and gawkers. Crowder's eyes gleamed with victory, salted with boredom. He announced the rules of his mercy. The storekeeper and the foreman nudged forward as if her children were bargains on a shelf. Elisa looked at Mara and Lily and felt the summer porch burn inside her like a coal that refused to go out. She reached for that jam jar with the water, and light inside remembered it sitting on the sill at home, catching what sun there was. She thought, you promised, and because promises spoken in a dying man's breath carry weight beyond law. She spoke again, softer, to the altar of her own vow, to the ghost ring on her finger and the fiddle that had gone silent. Together, she said. Together or not at all. When the stranger dropped a leather pouch on the rail and the coins and tooth glinted, Elisa didn't lift her chin because hope is lighter than pride and she didn't want it to blow away. She simply kept her hands on her girls and waited to see if Winter would recognize a man who looked like it and yield to him, a moment from happier past, bottled. The event that destroyed that life, itemized. The struggle to survive, a ledger of small hurts and smaller victories. The emotional wound, a promise soldered to bone. If a town had been listening harder than to the wind that day, it might have heard the sound of a woman stepping over something invisible and making it visible, by daring to speak the price aloud. He came through the crowd the way weather comes through a stand of pines, quiet, definite, and noticed only after the needles had already shifted. No flourish, no clearing of throats to make room for him. The townsfolk made that room on instinct, the same instinct that keeps a person from standing with their back to a cliff. His boots touched the churned snow and left square prints, edges clean as if the ground respected them. Not town boots, these had been cut for rock and grade, scarred, by chalet oiled to keep out creek water that had teeth. The uppers bore hand-stitched patterns like small rivers, not for decoration but to remember a winter evening by the fire when a man must keep his hands busy or else let his brain walk into its own shadows. His coat was the heavy kind trapper's, favor wool laced with a story of smoke. Smoke clung to him still, pine sweet with a bare bitter undertow that said he'd burned spruce wet rather than go without heat. The shoulders were frosted, snow had melted there and refrozen in a crust of glitter under the courthouse lamps. He took off his hat not at once, but when the bell of quiet rang around him, and the brim came up on a face that belonged to the mountain in the way an old tree belongs to its hill, not perfect, not pretty, but right, a beard winter thick, more practical than proud, a straight nose that had been broken and reset by hands that prized function over aesthetics. Across his left cheek, near the ear, the scar, white and forked like a coyote's track in fresh snow, the kind of mark that raises questions he never answers. His eyes under the hat brim were a flint blue with a curious stillness, as if he'd learned that moving too fast made animals bolt, men lie, and luck notice you. The first whispers preceded his name, like wind under a house before a storm hits the walls. That's him, said a woman who sold eggs. Lives above Kingfisher Pass, winter long, like it's not a place people visit but a thing that owns him. Trapper, a boy breathed. Bear man, my cousin swears he saw him once, carrying a cat's pelt with the head still on to shame. The men who'd lost it. Thomas Vale, came the name at last, from an older miner with a thumb missing. He said it with the careful respect one uses for a tool that can break bone if you use it wrong. Don't belong to nobody. Men who don't belong to anybody unsettle men who believe everything should. Vale's gaze did not go to Elisa first, nor to her girls, nor even to Magistrate Hale Crowder dressed in oilskin and power. He looked up past the courthouse east at the mountain itself, a quick calibration like a sailor glancing at a mast. Snow drove at an angle that told him where the pass was weeping. He slid his hat back on by habit, the crown tapping his scar as if the two were partners, then set his stance, one boot half forward, weight easy, arms quiet. He radiated a patience that had outlasted storms. A child coughed near his elbow. Vale turned his head slightly and saw her, a little thing in a shawl too thin for the day, cheeks chapped to open rawness. She clutched a loaf of bread mummied in paper, and the crowd's tide had nudged her against a step, nearly knocking her parcel into slush. Vale knelt. It was a simple movement, but it happened with a courtesy that made people look twice. He took the loaf as if it weighed more than it did, as if bread should never be handled casually. He set it on the step above the slush. Hold that edge, he told her softly, and waited while her small hands found the dry stone. He tugged her shawl up over both ears with a clean, practiced touch, the way a man might tend a skittish foal. Then he stood to give her his windshadow until she stopped, shivering like a leaf, no words to the mother, no gaze cast for credit. He simply kept the child between his coat and the weather until her breathing eased, and then he was a stranger again. It is a certain kind of kindness that takes nothing from the person it saves, not even the story. See that, murmured the exiler to the woman beside her. He didn't so much as look at the mother to collect her thanks. That's because he doesn't need thanks, the other said, half fearful, half admiring. Or because he's had none to take for years. On the courthouse steps, Crowder felt the weather change and disliked it. He reasserted his ownership of the air. As I said, he announced, louder now, Petitions will be heard for the placement of the miners. He looked not at Vale but past him, two men whose names could be written neatly in the ledger, names that paid taxes to him, and thus paid him. Vale reached into his coat then and produced the leather pouch dark with age, edges burnished by the rub of a man's thumb over miles. He did not shake it, did not jingle anything, he set it on the oak rail with a sound that was quiet and authoritative at once, like a hammer finding a nail without searching. He didn't untie it yet, he just let it be there, as if to say, talk your talk, but measure your words against something that weighs what life weighs. He looked at Elisa, not the way men look when they are calculating whether a woman is soft enough to use or brittle enough to snap. He looked as one might regard another creature found on the edge of a cliff in a storm sharing the edge, not judging the fall. The look said, I know where cold bites first. I know how to stand between teeth, and those who can't. Eliza met his gaze a heartbeat, no longer. Her chin did not lift. She did not give him thanks or plea, but something in the set of her shoulders eased, the way a rope slackens a fraction. When one more hand takes hold, the whispers fattened into stories that were mostly air and a little bone. He doesn't talk much, a teamster said. Traded me a wolf's tooth for new straps. Never haggled, just watched the sky like it owed him a debt. He packs salt like it's gold, another muttered. Says salt saves more lives than bullets. Lives up there with a dog, someone added. No, said a voice near the back. Quiet but certain, a shadow of a dog. The real one died a winter ago. He keeps the shadow because it knows the trails. Laughter nervous, grateful for permission to be ordinary in the presence of mischief. And died. Vale did not seem to hear. He slid the pouch's thong loose and parted the mouth of fingers with. Inside, coins winked worn silver, a brass token punched with a hole for luck, a nail repurposed as a keepsake, and the wolf's tooth polished by a year of palms. It was not the money that took the breath from the men on the steps. It was the fact that this man, who had refused every social tether the town had offered, had walked into their drawn circle and laid anything down at all. Sir, Crowder said, mouth sure and eyes sharp, this is not a matter of purchase. These are placements by statute and suitability. Vale's gaze slid to him, steady as a knot in a rope. Suitability, he said, tasting the word like dry meat. I heard a woman ask for her girls not to be split. Seems a suitable thing. To honor that is not for you to decide, Crowder replied. He smiled with half his mouth and let the other half do the talking. You are not known to this court. You are not assessed in this town. You are not. Vale turned his head, as if listening to something behind Crowder's voice, the wind's direction, the groan of eaves, the small panic of a horse hoof scraping ice. He did not interrupt, he did not hat-tip or drawl or challenge. He simply waited long enough that the magistrate's words shrank in their own echo. A commotion came from the fringe of the crowd, then a crate had tipped from a wagon. Glass clattering, in straw, the driver swearing that saints should cover their ears. Bottles rolled toward the steps, green and clear, chasing one another like fish in a stream. Vale's boot swung once, economical, catching a bottle before it smashed against the rail. He crouched and scooped two more from the snow as naturally, as if he'd been always in the business of saving other men's goods from other men's carelessness. Much obliged, the driver said, sweating with gratitude. I'm ruined if those break. Vale righted the crate with a lift from legs that had earned their muscle by carrying weight other men let mules take. He set the salvaged bottles back and pressed the straw tight around their necks. He didn't ask for a coin. He didn't accept the one offered. Tie your knots lower, he suggested mildly. Wind takes the high ones first. The driver nodded, chastened, and bent to relash the load. The crowd had watched all of this with that species of relief humans feel when a person of competence enters a scene to which they are attached but not equal. Unconsciously, shoulders dropped, men breathed easier. Women unclenched hands they hadn't known were fists. Crowder's jaw set. Power doesn't like competence, it didn't hire. Eliza's girls had watched too. The younger, Lily, held the doll tighter, not because she feared it would fall but because some part of her had already named the stranger as someone you hold things tighter around, to keep from breaking into wanting. Mara examined him with her father's old appraising squint, the one Matthew used for lumber. Is this piece true? Will it bear weight? Vale finally spoke, and his voice was lower than the air had predicted, worn smooth by disuse and by a habit of talking to creatures that startle. You got a list, he asked Crowder, of men wanting one girl and not the other. Applicants, Crowder said. Men, Vale repeated, making the word a framework instead of a flattery. You got a list, and I reckon some of those names keep their barns warmer than their kitchens. A ripple of offense, the storekeeper stiffened, the foreman's jaw clicked. The pastor coughed for peace. This is an officer proceeding, Crowder snapped, heat cracking through the oilskin of his voice. Your opinions are unwanted. Most are, Vale said. He wasn't smiling, but something near his eyes said he understood how men worked and didn't care to fix it. He rested one hand, big and scarred, palm down on the rail by the pouch. He didn't posture. He didn't flare his coat like a crow making itself big. He simply covered the leather as if covering a wound. Elisa studied that hand. Not the scars, though there were many. Not the strength, though it was obvious. She noticed instead the care, the way he had cupped the bread earlier, the way he had left straw snug around bottles, the way that palm flattened now as if to steady a table before someone tried to eat off it. She remembered Matthew's hand over hers on a jar lid the day the first jam sealed. She did not cry. She did not have tears to waste in public, where men counted everything you owned. The bell on the courthouse eave stirred once as a gust tested. Its chains ticked. The smell of smoke braided with wet leather and a ghost thread of peppermint someone had tucked in a pocket against coughs. The mountain went on being what it was, indifferent as the stars, and yet somehow listening. Petitions, Crowder said again, refusing the new gravity that had settled. Trying to make the day go forward by naming its parts. He turned pointedly, away from Vale and toward the storekeeper. Mr. Dwyer, your household is. Vale's hand lifted from the pouch, and 2 coins old silver eagle soft with years fell onto the rail side by side. They did not clatter. They landed with a muted certainty, the sound of meaning piling up. He met Eliza's eyes for the length of a breath, not asking permission, not offering ownership, only making clear the shape of what he had in mind. The town understood something then, without words. A line had been drawn, not yet crossed. The stranger had arrived and, before doing any rescuing, had made himself legible. Boots, coat, beard, eyes, hands, small kindnesses that cost him nothing and meant a lot. He had told the mountain in his bones to wait, but not forever. Mouth thinned. You are out of order, he said. I usually am, Vale answered, and let the storm fill the silence his words left behind. The sky leaned in like a roof about to cave. Snow beat the courthouse eaves in a steady, small violence, washing the world of color until everything was the same clean, pitiless gray. Hale. Crowder smiled, the smile of a man convinced everything would end as it had been arranged. Neat, efficient, profitable. He had a list and a gavel in his pocket heart. The crowd clustered like a single, hungry thing. Mr. Dwyer, he called, will the store provide lodgings for the older child? We will require a small apprentice fee to cover instruction. Dwyer, a man whose shelf of conscience had always been stocked with opportunity, stepped forward with the businesslike air of a man about to expand his workforce. Yes, he said, the word a ledger being made flesh. We'll take the girl. She can mend. Mind the counter. You'll be paid for instruction. Crowder interjected for those in the back who liked their cruelty softened by accounting terms. And the county will. He checked his papers with the satisfaction of a man who sees the world obey his pen. Murmurs of approval rippled through pockets of the audience like a benchmark chorus. Men shuffled, trying on the idea of 2 small hands behind their counters and 2 small mouths that might one day stitch faster than a hired girl who counted her days by the month. Eliza's throat compressed into a small, hard knot. Mara's jaw went rigid. Lily's small hands found the seam of her mother's skirt and dug there without pain. Just anchor. No, Eliza breathed, but the word was a bird with broken wings too stark in the wind. Crowder's face made a statute of civility. We cannot. He did not complete the sentence with any intention other than to remind them this was legal and therefore right. Placement will be as the court please, Eliza said. Her voice now trembled because the wind would not let it hold steadier. Please, keep them together. The magistrate turned, the movement smooth as a blade being polished. You are mistaken if you believe I shall be swayed by sentiment, he said. A few men near the front nodded, proud of their own hardness as if it were a badge. At that, Crowder folded the list like folding a blade away. He read names aloud with the casual cruelty of a man who'd been trained by ledgers and learned by them to love the edges. One by one, he called households. Dwyer and Sons, mill foreman, Carlisle, widow Homage. Name a sentence. Each name brought a small assent from the owner, a bargain made with a human commodity the town would wear in its day-to-day and hide in the closet at night. Bids-no. Petitions were punctuated by the clink of coins Vale had set down earlier. There was a pause when the storekeeper made his offer loud enough to be recorded and quiet enough to be a brand. We will take the older for 2 years' service and a small fee to the household. He looked toward Crowder for the cut that would make him flush with rectitude. The deputy reached out then, practiced as a man who has taken hold of other people's business before. He put his gloved hand on Mara's sleeve, a touch that had an efficiency to it, like a man prepping something for transport. The girl's skin was a thin map of blue veins, where cold was tracing claims. Mara flinched, and, in that flinch, the crowd heard a smaller sound than the wind, the sound of a promise bending. A woman cried out from the back, someone who had spent a life measuring what was left to her, and the sound cut the rehearsed murmurs. "You'll not split a family for a penny," she shouted, half indignation, half plea. A few hands rose in agreement, then sank under the weight of neighborliness and fear. Crowder's jaw hardened. "Order," he said. "You are interfering with an officer's proceeding." That was the law's favorite phrase, a stick wrapped in velvet. It kept people obedient and made them think themselves morally better for it. Vale did not move when the deputy's hand went to Mara. He watched, the way a man watches a tool he knows how to use but hasn't had to yet. His face didn't change, not exactly. It refined, like a blade catching a new light, an edge showing. He eased forward, places in the crowd making room because a man who spends winters where deer follow snowdrifts commands a sort of ceremonial distance. When he reached the rail, his boots made a sound like a promise kept, firm, muted. Nobody crowded him. He placed his palm on the same rail Crowder had looked at as if it were his property, and opened his mouth like a trapper opening his larder, not to claim but to reveal. "Everybody's got reasons," Vale said, low and steady, his voice more a weight than a chisel. "But a mother asked for a simple thing. She asked they not be parted." Crowder's smile thinned. "You're a stranger here, Mr. Vale. This is not a matter for strangers," Vale cut in, his words clean as winter air. The court's murmur went still enough that even the bell seemed shy. "That's true. I'm no magistrate. I'm no philanthropist either, but I know kin when I see it. I know what a mother's plea sounds like." He set his hand on the pouch again, and the townsfolk felt, for a second, the lift of someone putting both hands on an argument and not letting it slide. Crowder's hand twitched toward his coat pocket, toward the gavel that lived there figuratively if not physically. "You cannot." Vale met Crowder's look and spoke one line that split the gathered arrangement, like a blade through cloth together. "Or you'll have to take it from me in front of all these witnesses." The words landed. They were not a threat in the petty way men make braggadocio. They were the kind of thing a man says when he means he will do what he says, and does not need to rehearse it. They were simple, plain, and edged. The crowd blinked. The deputy's hand froze mid-air. The storekeeper's mouth opened a fraction, then closed as the future he had calculated caught frost. A rustle broke like a wave across the assembled faces. Some had never in their lives seen a man refuse to let law be the only language, and the spectacle was both terrifying and thrilling. Others leaned forward because if the mountain man would stake himself, maybe the ledger had cracks they could step through. Crowder's face betrayed more than his years. He had the look of a man whose comfort was being called by someone who offers no deference. "You would make a show of me," he said, "and of this town." "I would make a show of a woman's promise," Vale answered. He did not shout. He did not swagger. He simply set his jaw like a man setting a stone. "You can decide if you care about statutes more than people." Crowder's voice tried to be steel. "You are not law." "No," Vale admitted. "I am bone and winter, but I'm a witness." He turned to look at the crowd, letting his blue eyes sweep the faces. "This girl's mother asked one thing. You'll call it charity. I call it the shape of decency. If you'll not keep them together, if you'll send Mara to the store and Lily to another house, then I'll take them both, right now, in front of you. Let the law arrest me if you like, but don't tell me we couldn't have tried something." Kinder, a hum ran through the moon of breath and smoke and human steam. Crowder's palms flexed. He adjusted his coat with a small, practiced motion. "You cannot simply take children from the public eye because you fancy yourself a caretaker," he said. "The county has rules." "Rules," Vale echoed, and this time his voice held no disdain, only the sort of clarity that people use to cut rope when the knot is wrong. "Rules aren't a reason to break a mother's promise. You talk of law like it's an animal you tamed. I say it's an instrument meant for use, not for hiding your greed behind." A man near the front spat. He spat because words were cheap and spittle was cheap too, and the two had always come as deliverables in the town's economy. "Who are you to lecture us?" he demanded. "He lives above a pass where trees talk back. He's no one's judge." "I'm no one's judge," Vale agreed, "but I know a wrong when I see it." He unfastened the pouch and let 3 coins roll out across the rail carefully, like seeds, not to buy the girls but to buy a moment. He did not thrust them at Crowder or Dwyer. He set them down between the register of law and the register of life. People looked at the coins, and then at his face, and then at Eliza's. Eliza felt her pulse go loud, like a bell struck in deep water. Hope is not a light you can command. It is a draught that lifts when you are low enough to feel it. She had been skinned by humiliation, but now there was the oddest sensation of being seen in a way that did not require you to be small. It terrified her. What if it was only for show? What if the mountain man took the girls and then vanished into a snowbank? What if this was some other kind of theft? Crowder saw what the townsfolk did. The purse. He would have preferred it in his own palm. He used the law as a net, then tried to pull it tight. You proposed to purchase custody. You would make a private agreement under the eye of the crowd. Vale's reply was a simple sentence. The kind that makes a town reevaluate the difference between a handout and a hand taken in. I do not purchase custody. I offer shelter. I offer myself as a guarantor. I will take them under my roof and feed them and keep them together. If the county believes I am unfit, then they can make it known now. If not, then they will find themselves with a moral stain if they split them for coin. The deputy fidgeted in his boot. He knew the law, but also knew the weather. When a man like Vale spoke, real things could happen, things that made law look small in newspaper. He inhaled and then let it out, stalling on the precise point the magistrate wanted, who had legal standing. The clerk bent over his papers like a man who believed in ink more than in flesh. He made a noise that might have been a cough, but was more likely the sound of someone consulting the rules in his head and finding a crack. Crowder, who had made rules to fit his hands, chose the path of slow victory. We shall make record of your offer, he said, which is to say he would not refuse outright for fear of spectacle. But he would not accede without the town thinking. It had at least preserved its dignity. You will sign a statement, Mr. Vale, and prove your identity and capacity to care. Until then, no taking will occur. Then start your business, Vale said. Right now, make your record. He stepped back just slightly. He had not come to gnaw at the edges. He had come to stop a wrong. He had offered to stake himself to that. Crowder sniffed like a man who smelled a rival and felt slightly cheapened by him. He beckoned the clerk forward and, with the thin patience of a man who believed he could legislate charity, began to dictate the formalities. The clerk read out loud in a voice that attempted gravity and mostly achieved tedium. Vale waited. The deputy hovered over the girls, but hands trembled, now some with youthful zeal and some with a dawning shame. The crowd watched as if watching a play in which the ending was still uncertain. Eliza clutched Mara's hand. The older girl's fingers found her mother's so tight they white-knuckled. Lily tucked her face into Eliza's sleeve and breathed. Minutes stretched like winter. Rope the clerk asked questions that asked for paperbacks of proof, a place to sleep, witnesses, references. Vale answered not with certificates, but with the name of a cabin, directions up Kingfisher Pass, the sound of a door that creaked in cold and 2 low bunks that had room and a hearth that kept flame, even in a storm that meant to take it. He offered the name of a man who had seen him take in an injured fox once and had nodded without questions. The clerk frowned, looked at Crowder, who made a paper and then made another. The deputy squinted as if he could read the ash on Vale's coat and glean officialdom from it. The storekeeper tried then to press his offer, hands and fees and training. Other men chimed with variations of usefulness and necessity. Vale listened, and finally said, calmly and quietly, if you will not keep them together, I will. You can choose which side you want to be on. It was not a challenge of fists, it was a challenge of conscience. No one wanted the immediate answer. The town, trained to make decisions in the glow of convenience, had to count the cost of both law and shame. They looked at the magistrate, who adjusted his collar and made a decision that split into 2 parts, law and face. All right, Crowder said finally. He set his mouth in the bureaucrat's line. We will allow Mr. Vale to present his statements. We will make a record and take temporary custody pending verification. In the meantime, the girls shall remain. He paused, calculating, liking control, and missing it in equal measure. The pause was a lever. Vale's eyes went to Eliza, and in that glance she read not rescue but an offer of time to be careful, time to decide, time to leave something irreversible undone while the wind still howled. Eliza's thoughts collapsed inward and then rebuilt. She thought of the jam jars, the sound of the fiddle, Matthew's fingers, the promise between them at the last night, keep them together. She weighed the legal snarls and the man's steady eyes, and then, in a voice that was small and monumental at once, she said, we will go with him. For now. A stilled silence filled the space that had been waiting. The deputy's hand withdrew. Crowder scribbled, irritated that the decision had been made in the public square and not by his pen. A temporary arrangement, he said, the words smelling of authority and possibility. Subject to verification. Eliza gathered what little she had: 2 satchels, a shawl, a jar of dried apples she had saved like a spell, and drew her daughter's clothes. Her legs were steady, but her breath came in shallow, sharp pulls, as if she were learning the way to carry both shame and relief at once. She did not smile, she did not cry until they reached Vale's side, and he bowed not with ceremony, but by inclining in a way that said he acknowledged the burden and would keep it. She hesitated once, only once, and then let Mara put her hand in Vale's massive, scarred palm. The girl's fingers were not small against his, they fit like a plug in the socket. Lily clung to the doll and pressed it into Vale's other hand, and he took it with a single, solemn nod. The crowd parted. Some faces watched with envy and suspicion, others with a relief that felt like being let down gently from a ledge. Crowder watched him walk away, his mouth a hard line. He would write the record and do what the law asked in the days that followed. But the town had already seen the simpler thing. A man who would place himself between a system and a mother's promise, that as they left. Eliza's breath fogged the air and caught the word together again like a charm. She did not know what would become of them on a mountain, or if the hearth would be warm enough, or if the man who'd said so little would be the man her children would call father in season. She only knew with a prickling certainty like a hand to a hot pan that the world had tilted and, for the first time in a long while, leaned a fraction toward mercy. Behind them, the town murmured. Some called Vale foolhardy, others called him saint. Most called him a nuisance who had interrupted the machinery of business and law. But a few, those whose hands had been roughened by bread and loss, watched with something like gratitude, and in their faces Eliza saw, at last, the first small clearing in a long winter. They stepped off the courthouse, steps together, mother and 2 daughters, and the man who smelled of pine and kept the weight of winter in his bones. The deputy wrote as they passed. Crowder folded his papers like a man folding an omission into his coat. The bell above them rang once more, less like an executioner's chime now, and more like a toll for a thing changing hands. Eliza tightened her fingers against Mara's. The girl answered in kind. Vale fell into step beside them without asking. His coat flapped like a big, steady hand cupping them from the west wind. They walked into a snow that would forget their footprints if they turned back. The mountain did not hurry, neither did they. Had left one world, another waited taciturn and long. They left the courthouse with the air between them thin as breath over a kettle, fragile, hot, rapidly cooling. Town smells receded, horse sweat, coal smoke, the faint officious musk of inked paper. Vale led them away from Main Street's neat grievances toward the teeth of the country, toward a road that unraveled into rutted grey, then into a track that the wheel remembered and the snow sought to forget. The first part of the road kept them in a kind of brittle half-light. Snow lay in scattered bruises on the shoulders of fences, and the wind cut at their ears with a persistent, curious finger. Vale walked with a sure, easy stride that matched the land. He used the worn path, but took advantage of soft shoulders where hoof-stomped ruts might betray a foot. Eliza kept her daughters close, their hands warm and small in hers. The 3 of them are human, not against the elements. You'll want deeper, Vale said at one point, glancing down at their boots. Or you'll have to keep to the river where the crust's thicker. He didn't mean to be unkind. This was the economy of people who lived by weather, practical, immediate. Eliza swallowed and nodded. Thank you, she said, and the words were honest. Gratitude tastes sharp when you have been hungry for it. He stopped at the river crossing, and set his own pack down with the exactness of a man who had learned what mattered by losing things that mattered first. He untied a small parcel and drew out a strip of jerky, the smell of it smoky and rude in the clean air. He cut it into thin pieces and handed one to Mara, who accepted it as if it were yesterday's magic. Lily watched with solemn eyes, then took hers and bit with a seriousness that made Eliza smile despite the cold tugging at her mouth. He handed Eliza a tin cup and a small scrap of bread, crust wrapped in rag. He did not offer ceremony. He simply offered. The bread was dry and salted, but the tea he poured from the tin was hot enough to make Eliza think of kitchens and open windows and summers that hummed. She sipped until the hot soot of fear softened at the edges. This is the part where I ask about names, Vale said at last. Eyes on the river where ice moved like a slow thought. Not the kind you write on papers. The other kind. Eliza tightened her grip on the girls for a breath. She had rehearsed answers in the courthouse light and then erased them at the taste of Vale's jerky smoke. She looked at his hands, still gripping the cup with a steady patience. Eliza, she said. Eliza Harrow. These are Mara and Lily. Mara and Lily, he said, like a man tasting syllables. His voice suggested he'd kept hearing small names spoken to him across other kitchens and fires. Mara like the Mara, he asked, catching a small smile from the older girl, and Lily, like the flower. Both, Eliza said. Mara likes to fix things. Lily likes to chase light. She felt foolish explaining virtues like a ledger, as if they could be itemized for protection. But the way Vale nodded, as if these details really mattered, made her feel less like a debtor and more like a person counted for. They rose and trekked again. The path climbed and dipped and climbed in honest, muscle-stretching ways. The world narrowed to the sounds of their progress. Boot in snow, twig snap, the hush of the river behind low pines. Vale walked in a rhythm that made the girls shorter, steps feel like they belonged, and Eliza watched him in the way you observe a current beneath steady water. It keeps everything moving. As they climbed, Vale began the small acts a man who shares space performs without comment. He stopped when Eliza's muff came loose and twisted a corner under her chin. He nodded once at a broken branch and pointed it out as a hazard. Mara listened and stored the knowledge like a seed. He kept the slowest pace until Lily could manage the step without dragging her feet too often. Sometimes he walked slightly behind them, an unspoken sentinel, sometimes in front, finding footings that did not make them trip. When dusk thinned everything to a watercolor of gray, he chose a hollow for their first bivouac, a dip where wind could not line up like a spear and where dead spruce offered tinder. He set a low fire with the efficient movements of a man who had learned to coax heat from wet things. He arranged a shelter of tarp and spruce boughs to cut the worst of the wind, and then he shared his blanket with Eliza, tucking Mara and Lily into its fringe like two small sleeping birds. Not much, he said quietly, when Eliza tried to refuse with a woman's instinct to carry discomfort alone, but it kills the gnaw in the belly and buys warmth. He handed them more of the jerky and some dried apple rounds. The girls' faces brightened the way light brightens snow, unexpected and immediate. Lily asked, between bites, "Do you have a house with a fireplace?" "I have a cabin," Vale answered. "It's small and stubborn, like a mule. It keeps heat whether it likes you or not." His mouth very nearly twitched as if to smile, then kept still. Eliza let a knot in her chest unfurl a fraction. How she hesitated. The question lodged like a pebble. How can I be sure? How can I trust? Vale met her question without the bomb of platitude. "You can't," he said. "Not really." He set his jaw like a man who had spoken truth more useful than comfort. "You can only watch. I'm not asking for your trust in my stories. I'm offering you shelter and an option. You'll be watching me the same as I watch the mountain. The difference is, I'll be the one to try." Silence followed that statement, like a small, respectful god. The girls nestled, and the fire popped. Small prayers. Vale filled the air with something else than not stories of himself, which he hoarded like a man keeps maps when he's not in need of company, but a question that was soft enough to invite memory rather than demand it. "You said your husband played a fiddle," he asked, as if remembering might be itself a kind of warmth. Eliza's hands folded around the cup until the tin bit into her palm. She exhaled and let a sliver of herself come back to being a person rather than a ledger of loss. Did Matthew. He made the house hum. He tuned the world to a certain kindness. The words tasted like jam left on a lip. "We had jars. We had a porch. We had all the ordinary things," Mara added, shy and proud. He could make a tune that made the cows come home early. Lily, who had already fallen asleep against the blanket's hem, dreamed noise softly, words half-formed. "Papa, that sounds like a good man," Vale said. A dangerous sort to miss, but was no pity in him. Rather, a recognition. He poked the fire with a stick and considered the curl of smoke as if it had a script. Eliza felt the old wound open like a window left unlatched. She spoke of the belt, how the mill changed, how Matthew took the overtime, how a hand that once coaxed music now could not earn the same coin. She told them about the letter, the surveyors, and the day with the fever. She said the names of small humiliations, the pawnbroker's pity, the clerk's polite glance, because small cruelties are what often make the big ones possible. Vale listened without comment, but his eyes were not idle. He watched the way Eliza's fingers moved when she spoke of Matthew, how they smoothed an invisible table, and the way Mara's jaw set when the mill's name came up. When she finished, he didn't offer platitudes. He asked instead, "What do they want to be?" Mara's answer came quick, like a bolt thrown true. "I want to know how to fix a roof that won't keep wind out. I want to mend things so they stay useful." Lily, sleepy, said, "I want to find light." Favorite answers for a man made of land and weather. Vale nodded as if he'd been a carpenter who'd set plans early in life and still admired the rightness of a measure. You'll learn, he said, but not in the way Dwyer thinks learning comes, not under a bell that rings for labor. Learning where I live is about keeping your hands honest and your head clear. You'll bark wood, you'll check traps, you'll learn where a trail gives out and where it's safe to cross. That's the sort of schooling that keeps you alive. Eliza heard his terms and felt them like a new currency, barter that bought time and hands that paid in usefulness rather than coin. She glanced at Mara, whose eyes brightened at the picture of useful knowledge. The older girl straightened as if she had been given a spine. Night deepened and stars began to pepper the sky like pinholes in velvet. Vale's fire was modest but steady, and he kept one eye on it while the other watched their small forms. Once, when a wind tried to wedge itself under the top, he rose and adjusted the bows, tucking them tighter. He hummed then a low, wordless sound, and Eliza, listening, felt a strange new kind of safety. Not the safety of law, which had been a paper shield that blew in wind, but the safety of competence. "Where is it you keep the children?" she asked finally, voice small. The question meant more than the place. It meant whether the man's answer would include a hearth that would not trade them for convenience. "Above Kingfisher," he said, "a cabin with 3 beds and 1 stubborn roof. It takes a week to get there if the passes are good. It can take a month if winter decides to be rude." He shrugged as if both were part of the day's weather. "We'll travel slow. We'll stop when it's necessary. If you're with me, we travel as a thing that keeps watch." Eliza wrapped the blanket tighter around the girls and felt, for the first time in many moons, that the future might be a thing they could plan for instead of survive. The night gnawed and the hills listened. Somewhere, a fox moved like the slide of a secret. Under the tarp, the 3 of them breathed and counted small mercies. When the fire had burned low and the cold pressed, Vale produced a wool cap the girls could share, and the older took it with a dignity that made Eliza almost weep. She stroked Mara's hair until the steady rhythm felt like a promise. Outside, the mountain darkened into a single vast shape, and the river murmured, patient as a teacher. Inside that hollow, with jerky and dried apple and a blanket that smelled faintly of pine, 3 fragile lives began to knit a pattern that had not been expected at the courthouse steps. They slept then, in fits and starts, like people who had learned to be ready for waking. Vale kept the fire for a long while, then rolled up his coat and lay with his back to the wind, one ear tuned to the night. The family's breathing matched in time to shallow. One deep hand for a few hours, the mountain yielded a courtesy. It would not take them yet. Night was fuller in the mountains, the dark thicker, the air carved by stars that seemed to stare with distant patience. Under Vale's coat in the low light of the cabin, Eliza slept a kind of thin sleep, one eye open to the world of small dangers. In the day's small intervals she sorted memories like coins, passing the bright ones one way and tucking the dull for later. By the fire's last ember she let a truth out that had been folded so many times it felt like a different fabric. She had a secret she'd worn like a second shift. She had pawned more than the wedding band. She had pawned the fiddle. It was not something a woman says because pawnshops make for ugly confessions. It was something she had kept because the fiddle carried a man's hands inside it. The particular warmth of Matthew's palm on the wood was a private geography she had pledged to preserve. Pawning it had been a wound performed in private, a choice made for medicine, for flour, for the sound of the girls' small mouths being fed. But the fiddle's absence rang like a missing string in her chest. Each time she reached for the sound of him now, there was silence and a debt card smell of old paper and the pawnbroker's pity. She had not told Vale, she had not told Mara or Lily. Keeping that secret felt like hoarding a shame the way you hoard a few coins under the mattress. Practical, low in light, heavy by night, the flashback opened like a split in rock. It was a room that once had been loud with music, with Matthew's arms making the air into a language. The wood floor had a groove from where his foot kept the beat. The kettle had a rhythmic tap against the stove because Matthew hummed it in time. A week before the fever found him strong, they'd danced in the kitchen to a song he'd invented for Mara's naming day, sending a fine rain of flour over their heads in celebration. The girls had clapped and the world had felt close enough to put a hand on. In that memory, Matthew smelled of sweat and cedar and something homey that belongs on a porch. He had handed Eliza the fiddle and told a joke so dry she laughed until she cried. Then the next day a letter came. Then a belt leaped. Then the fever like a cloud that swallowed the house's light. Another memory colder kept an X in a jagged edge like a trip on frozen stone. The pawnbroker's shop smelled of oil and old leather. The man behind the counter had eyes that didn't look like eyes so much as instruments of economy. He had turned the fiddle over with business curiosity and pushed a sum across the table. It was barely enough to keep them through a week, but it bought the medicine that kept Matthew breathing another night. Eliza remembered the sound the fiddle made when he set it down, a sound like a small death, and how she promised herself she would never again let music be a thing to be given away. She promised, and then the ledger of life, having other plans, had to sell the ring later, then bread, and each sale felt like letting small parts of Matthew's life be auctioned to the town. The secret shifted its weight when she confessed it, quietly before sleep, speaking to the wood of the cabin and not to Vale. I sold the fiddle, she told the rafters. The words had a finality like a lid snapping. She waited for the night to scold her, but only the slow creak answered. In the morning, Light sat on the sill like an uninvited guest. Vale brewed a kettle and noticed the movement of her hand smoothing the blanket over Mara as if brushing a wound. He offered no pious words. Instead, he set his palm gently against the jar of dried apples she had tucked away and then looked into her face with a kind of hush you use when someone hands you something they cannot part with. "You are right to keep them close," he said. "There's small things that make the house a home." Eliza blinked. The script of kindness did not require immediate repayment. She realized she had been waiting for condemnation like a storm and instead received the weather's small neighbor, rain that cleans rather than destroys. She tried the secret on him like a garment she'd feared would not fit. "There's more," she said. "I handed away the fiddle after Matthew sickened." She stopped because the memory had teeth. She expected Vale's face to sharpen, to register that she'd deprived them of a thread back to the father. Instead, he lowered the kettle's spout with the dignity of someone who thinks before he speaks. "You did what you had to," Vale said simply. "There's a difference between what we should keep and what the world forces us to do." His voice had no lecture. It had a consideration that let her hold the shame and not be overwhelmed by it. Beneath the cabin's small roof, the girls were like two sprigs learning to bend with the wind. Mara picked up lessons in tiny practicalities, the way to file a nail without cutting your thumb, how to splice a rope, how to mend a tear with enough thread left, not because Vale commanded it, but because he did with his hands what a man who lives by making must do: fix what breaks. Eliza watched a bone of the older girl harden from brittle into useful, but deeper than any lesson was the fear that had lived in Eliza's ribs like a secret tenant. The fear that one day Crowder or some other man with a ledger would come for the girls again, and that this time they would not be defended by a man whose shelter smelled of pine and who kept wolves' teeth on twine. The worry was practical legal papers, verification, the deputy's uncertain thumbs, but also elemental. She feared the girls would be moved like cargo and their memory of Matthew and of her would be rinsed away in a place where no one had danced in a kitchen before. The worst part of this fear was that it made her consider choices she had not wanted to make, bargains with men whose faces fit their wallets. One night, a month into their journeying and settling near Vale's cabin, the mountain offered a test. A stranger came down the path, not the polite kind who left coins on the table and left, but a man with a purpose and a seal like a paper noose. He carried an official-looking writ, and a voice that had corners where laws liked to sleep. His name was Jeb Halling, a clerk of the county, a voice for the parts of the law that preferred certainty to mercy. He said the county had received information, had opened a file, had a list of arrears, and that procedural he had come to verify custody. Eliza's breath left her like a bell clapping empty air. The secret that she had carried with such care now burned like hot coal. She had nothing to show for the fiddle but a faded receipt in a memory. The pawnbroker had already taken his ledgers to a fever of bookkeeping when he'd moved to another town. The fiddle's trail had gone cold like a stream in frost. When Halling asked for proof of identity, of guardianship, of residence, Eliza's throat closed. The cabin felt a small boat bobbing in a sudden swell. Vale listened to Holling's recitation, with a narrowed patience that hurt him where quiet men can be hurt. He did not shout, he did not shove Halling back into his own legalisms. He produced instead a note, simple, worn, and yet anchored, signed by a neighbor at the ridge who had seen him take in an injured dog, who'd observed that Vale had kept the animal healthy and that he'd seen Vale host strangers in need without a complaint. It was not a law's paper but a neighbor's. The deputy who accompanied Halling frowned at it as if the ink might be contagious. "You cannot simply take custody without proper certification," Halling said, "and I have orders to ensure the county's wards are accounted for." "You can read the writ," Vale said. "But you'll also read about a woman who asked her children remained together and a man who offered them shelter. We can make records. We can wait." But I will not hand them to a ledger if the ledger's going to split them for coin. Holling's eyes sat somewhere between the book and the Manand, he realized, with the slow confusion of someone counting steps he'd never thought to climb. That the town he'd left had come to have a way of seeing things and justifying them. With ink, this place, this patch of woods and small cabin, had a different sort of measure, the measure of hands and keeping. You'll sign forms, Holling insisted. You'll be subject to inspection. The county's welfare officer then send them, Vale interrupted. Bring your paper and your men and let them read my floorboards. Let them count the beds. Let them see whether the girls are clean and fed. I will not hide under a mountain of words. Holling left grumbling and with a promise that the county would review. He favored authority over quiet punches. But the visit left a residue of dread. Eliza lay awake that night with the terror of losing the girls running along her spine like a small animal pacing its cage. She saw the pawnbroker's shop in every soldier's eyes and the courthouse in every shadow. The secret the pawned fiddle had shifted from private guilt to possible legal leverage. If the county found reason, if a man with the right pen decided that a mother's small errors disqualified her from claim, then even Vale's promise might be counted as eccentricity instead of sanctuary. The fear was a weather that settled, and then churned, returning in gusts. Vale watched her at the window when she thought herself alone, the outline of his face a profile against the snow. He did not press her to speak. He did not lecture on survival. He watched the way the night had settled on her like a shawl. Then, in the small way of men who give support without theater, he took from his chest a small rag-wrapped bundle and set it on the table between them. It's nothing grand, he said. Just a scrap of cloth and a note I found once in town. He folded the scrap out, a small score music note scrawled in a cramped hand. Sound like somebody you knew, he said. Maybe not your fiddle, but a tune can be shared. Hands closed over the paper like one closing a wound. She did not pretend the paper could be a fiddle, but for the first time since the pawnbroker's counter, someone had offered a piece of Matthew's music back without demand. It was not restitution, it was recognition. Vale's silence built a small bridge between them. He did not solve the legal snags, he did not make debts disappear. He did something quieter. He kept being where he said he would. He kept scaffolding safety with slow hands, the sort that could mend a roof or stitch a sleeve or take in a child and not be dulled by the repetition. Eliza slept that night, not with the certainty of law but with the certainty of presence. The fear that the county might come back remained sharp as an icicle, but beside it was something new, the knowledge that someone would stand when the world tried to move their things like they were nothing more than inventory. It was a small thing. But in cold seasons, small things are often the ones that keep you alive. The mornings on the ridge had grown into a small ritual. Fire mending, check the traps, and listen for the mountain's small coughs. For a few weeks the world had been a series of manageable tasks: wood, water, food, and evenings that into a quieter domestic music Eliza hadn't thought she'd hear again. The girls learned to knot with fingers that moved like instruments. Mara took to measuring wood with the careful eye of someone learning to keep a roof from leaking. Vale's cabin proved stubbornly hospitable, saving them in layers: first roof, then a hearth, then a rhythm, then a messenger came down the pass like a held breath being let loose. He was a horse and man thing that hammered at the slope, breath steaming like a small forge. He had the county's markling sealand a hard edge at his jaw. He did not dismount politely. He arrived with the business of law in his hand and the speed of it behind him. Hauling, Vale said, the name flat as flint. The deputies. Earlier visit had been a warning. This was an arrival with teeth. Hauling did not smile. He spat into the snow as if to mark territory, clicked the writ in his mittened fingers, and spoke with the friction of someone reading aloud a clause that had been practiced. By order of Magistrate Crowder, he said, I must verify custody and, if irregularities are found, secure the county's wards. Elisa felt the blood withdraw from her face in a slow, pale tide. The thing she had feared, the machine of paper turning into action, had come with horses and a warrant. Mara bristled. Lily hid behind Eliza's skirts like a small animal remembering a trap. Vale stepped in front of them the way a man steps in front of a door. He will not let the wind swing open. Then read it, Vale said. But you'll do it where others can see. No private hands. If you come to take them, do it under the sun and the eyes of the town. Holling's face hardened. We will do what is required by law. He glanced once, narrowly, at the cabin. There were men behind him, threshed out and useful, the kind of men who knew how to lift a thing and make it go where they pleased. They smelled like stable and coin. One of them had the look of a foreman who'd been promised a handy apprentice. Vale's voice kept level. Then do it. But if you move a finger toward them and they are to be split, you answer to those present for the shame of it. Holling's face was a thin map of authority. We have the writ, he said. We have orders. I will execute them. Execute, Vale repeated. The word hung like a blade. Then execute them in daylight where witness can see. Harling went for his paperwork as if the law could be handled like a gun. The men behind him began to fidget. They were not used to being asked to show their conscience. The horses shifted hooves soft on packed snow. Somewhere above, the mountain made a sound like a throat clearing, the sound of a slope settling into itself, of snow listening to wait. Clerk Harling, with authority in his hand and ink on his lips, did not like the delay. He barked a curt order to his men. Secure the girls for verification. One moved forward, long-armed and confident, and put out a gauntlet hand toward Mara. The girl recoiled, not from touch so much as from the idea of being handled like an invoice. Vale moved, like spring uncoiling. He took a step forward, closed the distance, and put his palm flush against the man's chest, an old, intimate kind of push that used more intention than force. The man staggered back a fraction, eyes wide as if he'd struck an unexpected rock. You step to a mother, Vale said low and steady. You step to me. The man's hand curled under his mitts. Harling blinked as the confrontation sharpened. You will not obstruct an officer, he said, a phrase used like a whip. Will not let you split a mother's promise, Vale answered. The men behind Harling muttered. One scoffed, another cursed under his breath. For a moment the cabin was a small island of will against the sea of law. Then the mountain chose to speak in a voice no man had written in any ledger. Far up the pass there came a roar, a distant tearing that made the very air feel as if it had been struck. Snow gave under its own weight. The ridge above them let go with the sound of 100 shutters opening at once. The sky filled with the angry white of a slide dot. It happened like a judgment. The avalanche came down the flank of the mountain, first a trickle, then a wall sounding like thunder breaking into a trillion smaller thunders. Men who had thought themselves appointed by statutes forgot yes and no and simply watched. Air was full of flying ice and the sound of 1,000 small avalanches inside a larger one. The path they had walked was being rewritten. Harling's men reacted like trained beasts. They spurred their mounts and scrambled for higher ground. The horses screamed and reared, throwing men and gear in the panic. Harling tried to collect his papers as if they might anchor him to the world. But the snow had other plans. Vale did not look up to see whether the mountain had chosen sides. He looked only to the place where the girl stood, Eliza's face ashen, Mara's hands white at her sides, and he moved with the immediacy of a man who had spent winters making instant right decisions. He grabbed Mara by the arm and hauled her back into the lee of the cabin where spruce boughs would catch wind and lessen the blow. He pulled Lily into Eliza's hold and wrapped the mother and child in his coat like cloth. He shoved Eliza behind the door and keyed the latch with his weight. The avalanche hit the slope in a grey roar and then tried to unmake everything in its path. It pushed trees down like toothpicks and ripped snowbanks into ribbons. The men who had tried to flee were not all lucky. A foreman's boot went out from under him. A horse's leg snapped under a falling slab. A plank from a wagon splintered and stabbed the air. The slide's edge shaved a line through the forest and threatened to take the cabin's lee if it could. Vale worked like a man who had practiced for such a silence. He wedged his shoulder against the door, braced a trunk against the wind, bellowed orders sharp as hatchets. Get inside. He shouted at the other men who had not fled. Get under the overhang. He ran to a fallen spruce and jammed a thick end under a sagging rafter, then hauled the flailing body of a man clear as the snow tried to bury him. He did not speak of law. He spoke only of breath and the size of available pockets. In the shock and the spray, a slab of ice struck Vale at the temple. It was a glancing blow, but sharp enough to send a white-hot flare across his vision. He kept moving. The wound bled a red seam through the frost, as if the mountain had forced blood to violate the landscape's color. The cold bit into the bare patch where his skin met fur, and he blinked snow out of his lashes like an animal. A falling tree nearly took the porch. Mara, quick and steady, dove and dragged a woman free, showing the knack that comes from watching a man's hands long enough to learn the rhythm. Eliza scrambled to pull Lily into the cabin, breath arrhythmic as the shaken, and then noticed a younger man pinned by a broken sled. She crawled, heart pounding, and found a strap tangled near his shoulder. Without thinking, she used the last of her strength to loosen the knot and free him. The man coughed bitterly, then looked at the small woman who had risked herself and could only find words in the shape of a wet, grateful smile. Vale's injury throbbed, but not loudly enough to slow him. He had a long list of broken things to saw and secure. He coiled a rope, anchored it to a gnarled root, and began pulling men clear from the white tide's leftovers. The deputy who'd been hesitant at the courthouse steps found himself clutching at splinters and veils, offered hands with a humility not learned at a clerk's desk. Harling, splattered with snow and ink, tried to read his way out of danger and found the paper useless against the mountain's appetite. When the avalanche's first assault spent itself and the rain of snow slowed to a hiss, the scene was a tableau of survival and wreckage. A horse bled where it lay. A man's arm was twisted at a bad angle under a plank. The cabin stood fragile and steaming. Smoke curled like a small victory from a battered chimney. Vale, blood wetting his hairline, sat on a broken sledge runner and let the world tilt for a breath. He pressed his palm to his temple, tasting iron and mountain cold. Eliza crouched beside him. She had a strip of linen and a small stick of sapwood she'd used as a splint earlier in the trip. She tore a strip and, with fingers that trembled despite themselves, began to bind his head. She had learned bandaging from an old woman in town once over a kettle, the lessons kept like a small, practical liturgy. "You're bleeding," she said, voice tight. "I'm fine," Vale said, which in his language meant, "I will be." The words kept a bravado that was not quite denial but an economy of worry where he rationed fear for the sake of others. Mara dragged a water-soaked blanket and wrapped it around an injured man. "You'll live," she said, plainly the kind of certainty that comes from having stitches done in the dark and returning to work. She did not have medical words, only stubborn usefulness. Foreman, who'd earlier touted the girl's usefulness as a justification, watched his tone shift. He tasted something like regret. Harling, who had come with writs and rules, realized the smallness of man-made authority when faced with the raw, indifferent appetite of the mountain. He had come to execute papers and found instead a place to dig men from drowning snow. He did not at first know whether to be angry that his orders had been delayed, or grateful for his chest still beating. He had the clumsy learning of a clerk turned by weather into a humble instrument when the immediate danger had passed. And the men could breathe because the slope had decided it had taken enough. Vale stood on hands that shook a fraction and said, "We move. Now." The deputy and Harling gathered their scattered, wet forms, and the men who'd come with them looked smaller in the raw light of survival. Harling did not arrest anyone. His writ lay wet in the melting snow, ink running like a small concession. The mountain had changed something in them. For some, the sight of a man who'd put himself between law and a mother's plea made their ledger tilt. For others, the avalanche had been a reminder that decisions made by ledgers can be revealed as brittle when nature decides to test them. Vale's head banded. He tested his balance. The cut was shallow enough that the bleeding slowed under a strips. He bit back a smile that might have been pain or gratitude, perhaps both. The small injury was a coin of truth. He could be hurt, and yet he would still stand for them. The deputy cleared his throat and said, rougher in a voice he did not often use, "We'll be reporting this changes things." The writ he did not finish. The mountain had made the sentence unnecessary. Eliza's hands trembled in the cold as she finished, the bandage and tucked hair clear of the wound. She found herself looking at Velat, the man who had stepped forward to keep a mother's promise and for the first time. Gratitude moved into something like devotion. Not love in the way stories often croon, but the steady, clean gratitude of one human to another who had kept them safe. Mara, who'd done the quick thinking with the falling tree, found herself leaning against the cabin and laughing softly, the sound brittle and triumphant. "I can fix a roof," she said to no one in particular, and everyone heard the statement and understood it as more than a claim. It was a promise to herself. When Harling and his men mounted to leave, they did so with grease on their faces and smaller words than they'd arrived with. Harling's writ remained in Vale's pocket, damp but intact, awaiting the day when papers and testimony might be compared again at length. For now, the mountain had decided that the issue of custody would be postponed by nature's intervention and by the visible work of keeping one another from being swallowed. That night, the cabin's hearth glowed with a low, stubborn light. Vale's bandage was wrapped tight but not too tight. Eliza's hands had done the work of mending more than his head. The girls slept like creatures who had found shelter. Outside, the mountain held its snow and settled as if satisfied, or at least distracted. In the quiet after, Vale's voice came, low and wry. "You did good." Eliza felt the compliment like warmth. She had not expected to be useful in the way the mountain required usefulness. But that night she had learned that courage shows in the small physical acts: untangling a strap, pressing cloth to a bleeding head, holding another's breath steady when it wanted to run. The threat had come in both human and natural forms, and they had met both. It changed the way the town's legal machines would look at them when they came next. It changed the way the family saw themselves when they looked in a mirror of flames and found themselves whole. The slide left the world quieter in a way that felt almost sacred. Snow lay smooth where it had buried noise. Broken branches bristled like a sleeping beast's bones. For a few days after, the mountain seemed to hold its breath as if it had tested the town's resolve and decided to watch instead. Vale moved with a limp the first morning. A small favor the wound demanded, but he kept the pace steady. The avalanche had changed nothing about his determination and everything about the town's attitude toward it. They traveled slow after that, because slow was sensible and because slow let things stitch themselves back inside people. The track climbed and folded, and the air sharpened with a cold that cleansed the cruelty from town talk and left only what would survive the weather: hands, food, and the truth of someone's face in a white day dot. At night they camped under a sky that seemed to run its own slow program of stars, quiet, patient constellations that did not care for the paperwork of men. Vale built fires that took less fuel than a town's lamp and gave more warmth. He taught Mara to start a spark with flint and steel, explaining the angle like a carpenter explaining a cut. Mara's first successful strike surprised her so much. She giggled in a way that made the embers jump. Eliza watched, and something unbent in her, a small laugh she hadn't intended to keep but which was welcome all the same. Once, while the girls dried socks and Vale mended a strap that had split during the scramble, Eliza surprised him by asking, "Do you ever want more than the hut, a shop, a town?" He looked up at the place where the ashes made a grey map and said, "Sometimes, enough to sell what I trap and lend a hand to those who need it. Mostly, I like rooms that keep a person honest. Towns tempt people to forget what they can do with their hands." "You've chosen a hard life," she observed, not as judgment but as a fact to be named. "Hard keeps you awake," he said. "Easy makes you soft." Her gratitude came later in a smaller, brimming way, not a grand pronouncement but a practical gift. When they passed a thin stand of birch near a spring, she knelt and gathered small, round berries, cloudberries, a little tart and luminous, stucking them into the tin they'd carried since town. "For when the frost bites worst," she said, handing the tin to Vale, for sharing. He accepted the tin and nodded as if the gesture fit the scale of things. "We'll eat them on a bitter night," he promised. The girls listened as if this was a covenant, bonding built in the small domestic acts that sit between danger and habit. Vale taught Mara the right way to make a bed so it would hold heat. Eliza taught Lily how to sew a torn sleeve with tight, even stitches that would not catch. One evening, under a lean-to where the pine needles smelled like rain, Vale produced a battered harmonica from the pocket of his coat. He hadn't used it much in years. Sound, he believed, was a luxury when the body needed food, but the girls' eyes brightened at the sight as if a stained glass window had been set into the top. He played a tune simple and slow, notes that curled like smoke. Mara hummed as if remembering a rhythm her hands already knew. Lily clapped on the offbeats as if she'd been born to keep time. Eliza listened, the harmonica's thin voice making old rooms in her stand open places where Matthew's fiddle had warmed the air, and she allowed herself to be warmed in the cheap, steady way of the newly saved. She shared a piece of the dried apple with Vale, who accepted it as if it were a coin of trust. The nights changed them. Private fears softened in the face of common meals, shared chores, and the pattern of learning. Vale began, as men who are good at one thing do, to teach them other practicalities: how to read the weather by the sound of pines, how to find a rabbit's trail, how to tell when a stream under snow is safe to cross. He told stories sparingly, an old joke about a fox that stole a trapper's mitt, a dry account of a winter when the supply sleds were late, but he let the land speak most of the time. The mountain's language was patient and full of correction. Were small frictions, the necessary rubbing that buries tenderness in honest grain. Mara, who had learned to measure, would precisely chafed at being given domestic tasks she felt were beneath the skill she wanted. Vale noticed, and one night while the soup simmered, set her beside him to whittle a peg. "If you want to fix roofs," he said, tapping the wood, "you'll need a steady hand and the patience to begin at the slow things." He showed her a measure for a dovetail joint and then watched her try. The first cut was clumsy, but she corrected it, cheeks flushed, and by the third she had a small notch that made him nod with a manly pride that didn't ask for thanks. Dada Lisa watched these private lessons and felt something like relief. Mara's hands were finding work that fit the measure of her mind, and Lily's small questions were met by answers that used the world as classroom. Each evening their circle grew thicker with small gratitude. They found themselves telling each other things they had not told strangers: the color of a favorite shirt, the exact shape of a scar that once made a child embarrassed, the name of a lullaby scraped and learned in a kitchen gone silent. Those details flattened grief into living facts. One cold afternoon, when the sky suggested possible thaw, they crossed a slope where a stand of dead spruce made a natural cup. Vale motioned them into the hollow and set a small trap to test Mara's attention. It was the kind of check that taught rather than punished. "Trap's only useful if you know the animal you're after," he said. "Gentle with your fingers and quick with your eye." Mara crouched and watched. Storing procedure. She set the trigger under his supervision, and then they waited with the patient stiffness of hunters. After an hour nothing came, but the teaching had lodged. Mara's face held a concentration that made Eliza's chest ache in the honest way it does when you see a child take hold of a future. That night, Vale told them about the cabin. They were walking toward the one with the carved wolf over the door. He didn't romanticize it. He said it was wind tough and draft picky, that the roof had a stubborn leak on the north side that needed new planks, and the stove door stuck in the cold. "It's a place that tests you," he said. "If it teaches you patience, it will teach you how to keep people alive." Eliza found herself answering with a promise she hadn't expected to make aloud since Matthew's death. "We'll fix it," she said. The sound of her voice surprised her. Not a bargain but a vow. The girls echoed it too, small echoes that made the vow felt like a beam laid across a future roof. When they crested the last low ridge and the cabin came into view, small, squat, smoke curling like an incense gone stubborn, it looked exactly as he'd described: planks weathered to iron gray, a stack of wood heaped with practical obsessive care, the wolf carving scabbed by the years but still proud. Vala's door stood with a slight lean as if to invite a particular kind of resident. The sight of it was less a relief than a recognition, a place that already had shape and history and a capacity to receive. They set their packs down with the same ritual that had carried them here: grateful hands, small gestures, a tin of cloudberries tucked for later. Vale swung the door wide and the cabin breathed. Inside, light from a small dirty window across a patch of floor, and found an old rug that had once been brighter. There was a table, 3 rough chairs, and a low hearth heavy with soot and memory. Above the mantel someone had carved names into the wood in a looping, earnest hand. Vale touched them like a benediction and then set about making the place ready. Girls ran, exploring in the sort of hurry that costs nothing and gives much. Mara found a wood box with nails. Lily discovered a crack in the sill where the light came through and pressed her hand to it as if testing the warmth. Eliza stood by the stove and exhaled the breath she had been carrying for months. Vale set the stack of firewood inside and began to feed the stove with patient, efficient hands. The cabin accepted the heat like a reluctant animal taking a trusted hand. That evening they ate simple stew and sat with boots off and socks drying near the hearth. The room smelled of wood smoke and boiled root and of something softer, harder to name, the smell of a roof being earned. Vale leaned back and watched them. "This is not a home fixed by magic," he said, "but it will be a place that learns you, and you will learn it back." They laughed, a soft, private laugh of people who have crossed a thin and dangerous thing and found one another on the other side. Outside, the mountain exhales were slow and kind. Inside, Eliza laid a hand on Mara's head and felt the child's hair rough like the braid of rope, steady and capable. She looked at Vale then and did not say all the things she might have thanked, debt, gratitude, but instead slid a small scrap of cloth across the table, the scrap she'd used to patch the girls' socks on the way and which she now offered to Vale as a token of trust. He accepted it without fuss and tied it to the corner of the mantel like a small banner. "A promise," he said simply. They all knew what it meant. Outside, the wolf over the door watched like a sentinel carved from patience. Night fell and the cabin settled. The girls slept in the bunks, its wood sighing with the weight of small bodies. Eliza did not sleep easily. Old habits of waking to empty rooms had left a muscle in her ribs, but when she did finally drift, she slept with a new kind of depth, sleep that trusts for a while. Vale sat awake by the stove for a time, watching the last of the embers and thinking of roots and rations and the small logistics of keeping 3 lives together through a winter that would not be gentle. In that hush, the family had moved from being temporary guests to being a thing that might endure. The cabin had accepted them, the mountain had tested them, and they had answered with small, steady hands and vows of work. The quiet had a warmth that felt like the beginning of an ordinary life, harsh and honest, and exactly what they needed. The last ridge opened like a mouth and the cabin they'd seen from below resolved into particulars. A crooked porch with one step sunk deeper than the rest. hand-hewn beams dark with age, a small lean-to where snow-drifted tools waited like patient animals. The carved wolf over the lintel looked less like ornament and more like story, its muzzle worn by years of weather, its eyes still intent. Around the cabin, a low picket fence held a yard of rough promise, a woodpile stacked like a stout wall, a sled tied against the north side, an old millstone half buried that had once been a table. It was exactly what Vale had promised, stubborn, honest, and waiting for hands. Vale set their packs down with an efficiency that turned chore into blessing. "We'll make the north planks first," he said, lifting the hatch and revealing a row of rolled tar and spare boards. "Then the stove's latch. Then we'll fix the door so it doesn't bite in the wind." He spoke like a man naming axes. Each name was a project, and each project a promise to keep them sheltered. Inside the cabin, the space opened into a single room whose lines had been measured by smokers and children and the slow work of winters. A heavy table sat scarred at the center. On one wall hung a pegboard full of useful thingsals, a rope coiled, a small carving of a wolf's head that mirrored the one on the door. A cot in the corner bore the imprint of someone who'd slept there for seasons. Its mattress still smelled faintly of cedar and old wool. Above the hearth there were hooks where kettles had lived, and a small shelf for books, a ragged thing, with a single title about berries and another about knots. It was modest, but the room's bones were true. Mara strode inside like a girl who had been rehearsing this exact entrance. She ran fingers over the table, inspecting joints with the carpenter's head already present. "We need a new strip on the north lintel," she pronounced, voice steady. Vale smiled in a way that was almost private pride. "Good eye. We'll do that tomorrow. For now," he gestured to the stove. Heat. They worked with a rhythm of people who have earned their food by the swing of the arm and the patience of a file. Eliza swept her movements, small but sure, and Mara set about measuring boards with a ruler she'd fashioned from a straight twig. Lily found a place by the low window and pressed her face to the glass, delighted to see a patch of sky that had not been courthouse gray. The cabin accepted them like an animal accepts a hand, cautious at first, then content. That evening, after they had fed the stove and fixed the stubborn latch that had chewed at Vale's glove in the wind, he did something he rarely did in front of others. He set the harmonica on the table and tuned it by humming. Then he put both palms flat on the wood and looked at Eliza. "This roof is a promise, not a favor," he said, his voice steady and unexpected in its warmth. "You and yours don't answer to Crowder here. You answer to the hearth and the work and to the wind. You'll not be sold for coin under my watch." Eliza felt something in her chest loosen, an odd, dangerous relief that made her eyes prick. She wanted to say thank you in a way that fixed the debt, in language the courthouse would understand. "I owe you, there is ink for it, but this was not a ledger exchange. I don't know how to repay you," she admitted in the hush. "You won't repay me," Vale said. "You'll keep your promise. You'll teach the children to make what needs making. You'll mend, and we'll mend with you. That's repayment that lasts." His eyes held a kind of bartered dignity, not charity, but a covenant. "This place holds what you put into it." Mara, practical and blunt, cut in. "So what about school?" "I want to learn more than fixing roofs." Vale nodded. "We'll teach you what books they won't," and he paused, considering how to fold world into possibility. "If the road's clear in summer, we'll trade for an hour with the teacher in town. You'll read more than you can at the fire." They ate from a single pot and shared stories that were small and domestic. The fox that had stolen a trapper's mitt again. The time Vale had accidentally used spruce instead of cedar and had a door that smelled like a carpenter's cough for a year. Laughter moved the room like a guest who takes his time leaving. Night pooled around the window and the wolf carving watched over them as if he were a quiet judge of small virtues. After the dishes were stacked and the girls tucked in their bunks, Eliza sat by the hearth and let Vale's words sink like coals. She thought of Crowder's offices, the ledger's cold teeth, and the public square's humiliation. Here, it seemed, the ledger had another column, one of work and witness, and the slow accrual of safety. She saw Mara's hands learning dovetails, Lily's small mouth humming as she wove a scrap of thread into a ragdoll. The harmonica's thin voice, a new echo of a fiddle lost to a pawnbroker's pity. When the first morning light came thick and white, they woke to the small certainties of homestead life. A pot simmering, a log that needed splitting, a trap with bait that required checking. It was ordinary in the way that mattered. The world they'd been given was not an escape so much as a new contract. Earn your shelter with skill and presence, and the shelter will keep you. Eliza stood on the porch at dawn and watched the ridge line thaw soft at the edges. She felt the Roof's warmth like an answered prayer. Vale came up beside her, rubbing his hands, the smell of smoke and oil on his palms. "You think you'll be staying?" he asked, an invitation disguised as a question. She looked at Mara, waking in the doorway, hair unkempt in a way that made her seem more alive than she'd been under shame. Eliza thought of the jam jars and the story of a husband who had taught them melody, and of the promise she'd made by a kettle at the end of his life. "Yes," she said simply. "For now, for as long as the roof holds." The answer landed, like a kind of peace. Vale nodded, and for a moment the two of them stood listening to a small bird's call, someone unaffected by ledgers and laws, reminding them that the world continued in its own deliberate way. Winter kept its long eye on the ridge, slow and impartial, yet inside the cabin, 3 lives unspooled into a new day's small tasks: bread, mend, lesson, rise, tend, teach. Time does the gentle work that speeches cannot, knitting frayed edges, making new habit a frame for memory. The girls' laughter became a measured part of the cabin's soundscape. Mara's hands learned the vocabulary of joints and knots. Lily learned to listen for the river under the snow and could, after a month, tell when ice would hold a foot. Eliza kept a small ritual. Each morning she set a jar on the sill and filled it with something like proof that the world would continue. A bright feather, a strip of oilcloth, a coin found in the saddlebag Vald kept. The jar was not a savings for the law to count. It was a ledger of the small mercies that told a woman she could breathe. Neighbors came in the Slowway Mountain, neighbors always do, with a package of smoked fish, with a rod of honey, with the news that the supply sled had finally made it through the lower pass. They were rough people who spoke frankly, and the girls learned quickly that community here was measured by who helped when a rope broke, not by who had the best ink on file. There was a kindness in that bluntness that felt less like charity, and more like reciprocal trade. It fit them. Crowder did not disappear. The town kept its habits. He had his papers and his law, and a certain satisfaction that comes from making rules. But the story of the day on the courthouse steps had traveled farther than he intended. The man from the past who'd refused to let a promise be broken was now part of local speech. Some called Vale meddlesome, some called him honorable, some called him dangerous, words meant to put an edge on a life they did not understand. Vale, for his part, kept his head down and his hands working. On a late thaw morning, while the girls braided a new rope and Eliza sewed new curtains from patched shirts, a hawk feather appeared tied to the cabin latch. It was the feather of a bird that had flown high and watched far. Vale found it and did not ask who had left it. He simply looped it into a small leather thong and hung it by the wolf carving. "This means someone's watching the trail," Mara said, half maybe not kind. Vale accepted the thought without alarm. "It means someone knows how to send a message," he said. "A hawk watches for more than just rabbits." Eliza's hand went to the feather and felt a tremble she could not call by name. It could mean a friend watching, or a rival noting where good things had taken root. Either way, it meant the story was not closed. The mountain keeps its secrets, and people keep their own. Sometimes they meet like two wild things on a narrow trail. That evening, Vale sat by the hearth and tuned the harmonica carefully. The tune he played threaded through the cabin like a small map back to memory. Eliza hummed along, a sound that fed the hearth as much as timber. Mara whittled a peg and then tested its fit in a new notch she'd cut that afternoon. Lily, curls catching the stove glow, practiced a small stitch pattern Eliza had shown her. "We'll teach them to read when the road opens," Vale said, as if planning a future like a farmer plans his rows. "We'll make tools and trade, and, when spring lets the lower town breathe again, we'll go down for what we need." Eliza leaned against him, not in surrender but in the matter-of-fact closeness that comes from shared danger. Her heart still carried the weight of loss. Grief does not erase itself with shelter, but it shifted its place on her body into something like gratitude. They kept its edges. She had given a promise at a stove and found a man whose reply had stunned the town and steadied her life. Far on the ridge, where Kingfisher Pass took its slow breath, tracks led on and then disappeared. The feather on the latch caught the last of the daylight and flashed like a small signal. Someone had watched and someone had answered. The future would bring questions, yet verification and townsmen's curiosity. Perhaps a man with a ledger who would not rest. Perhaps another storm that would test the cabin's seam. But for now, the girls slept and the stove kept warm, and a wolf carved in old wood watched over them like a promise kept. The story closed on a domestic note. 3 people who had been almost lost, now learning the grammar of rebuilding. Yet the feather and the quiet of the mountain suggested a new chapter waiting to be walked, one that might call forth the same quiet courage Vale had shown at the courthouse steps. The next road would arrive on some wind, and when it did, the Family by the hearth would meet it together. Winter had taken much. It had returned something rarer still together.